You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode contains discussions of pedophilia and child abuse. Listener discretion is advised.
Daniel Morcombe, a 13-year-old boy with bright blue eyes and dark brown hair, stands at a bus stop beneath an overpass. Today, he is wearing a bright red t-shirt. It's Sunday, the 7th of December 2003 at 2:10 p.m. He's waiting for a bus to take him to the Sunshine Plaza Shopping Centre so he can get a haircut and buy some Christmas presents. At home are his parents, Denise and Bruce Morcombe, his identical twin brother Bradley, and his older brother Dean. A bus passes, but it doesn't stop. On it is a 13-year-old girl who notices the boy on the side of the road. There's a gaunt man standing behind him. Another girl on the bus, who is 17 years old, also notices the pair. She will remember the man with him as having long hair, a goatee and sunglasses, with a sports bag by his side. The bus driver motions to the boy that there is another bus coming. But by the time that other bus gets there, the boy in the red shirt is gone. In the years afterwards, police would identify and befriend the pedophile they believed targeted Daniel that day. It would become one of the most remarkable police stings in Australian history, providing chilling insight into one of our country's most evil killers. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. Today's episode is about the disappearance of Daniel Morcombe, and I'm speaking with Kate Kyriakou, the chief crime reporter for Courier Mail Brisbane, whose book, The Sting, details the undercover operation that caught the man responsible. I wanted to begin on a Sunday afternoon on December 7, 2003, when 13-year-old Daniel Morcombe was at a bus stop. What had he been doing that day?
So he and his brothers did a bit of work for a neighbour picking passion fruit, and they were supposed to do it that morning, but it had rained. So I think it got delayed, and that meant that they couldn't go with their mum and dad, Bruce and Denise, to their work Christmas party. So Bruce and Denise went without them and left the boys at home to go do their passion fruit picking. And then after that, Daniel decided to go to the Sunshine Plaza, which is sort of a local shopping centre on the Sunshine Coast. He needed to catch the bus there. And he'd done that many times before. He knew how to do it. He had a phone card that had money on it in case, anything went wrong, and he could call home and let his parents know that he was going to be late. And he was a very responsible kid. So he'd actually done that in the past where he'd missed the bus and he'd called home and said, "Mum, I'll be on the next bus." So he asked one of his brothers to come with him, and they were doing other things. So Daniel ended up going alone. There was sort of like an unofficial bus stop under the overpass about, I think it was a kilometre from their house. So he went down to catch the bus in the afternoon. He wanted to get a haircut and buy Christmas presents for his family. And he waited for the bus, and it sort of never came. And he was waiting there quite a while, and there'd actually been a breakdown further up the line, I suppose you could say. And when they sent a replacement bus, that bus was told to go express to the plaza because everyone had been waiting a long time, and that another bus would be coming, I think it was only about 90 seconds behind him to pick up the rest of the passengers. So that bus driver drove past Daniel and saw him, and Daniel sort of stepped out and waved for the bus. There was a man standing behind him. And the bus kept going, obviously, because it'd been told to run express. And that bus driver radioed the bus behind and said, "There's a couple of people waiting at that stop. Can you stop and get them?" And when that bus got there was nobody there.
So Daniel didn't come home that day. What did the next 24 hours look like for the Morcombe family?
So when Bruce and Denise got home for the Christmas party, they asked the other two brothers where Daniel was. They said he'd gone to the plaza, and, Bruce and Denise knew what time the buses came in, so they expected him to be on one of the later buses, and he didn't arrive. So Denise went to check the bus stop to see if he'd gotten off the bus, and he hadn't. So they assumed he was catching the last bus. Then when he wasn't on that bus, I think they drove to the plaza to see where he was, and he wasn't there either. So he wasn't on the last bus. He wasn't at the bus stop. He wasn't on his way walking back home. When they drove to the plaza, he wasn't there either. So at this point, Bruce and Denise are quite frantic. As I said before, he was a responsible kid, so it was very unlike him. And so they stopped a bus driver at the plaza and said, did he get on that bus? And that bus driver wasn't really able to help. And so then they went to the police, and the police took down some details but really didn't log it in the system. It had only been a couple of hours, and they just assumed that he'd caught up with some friends. There was a lot of discussion about the response of police at that point in time and whether they should have taken it more seriously. And I think over the years there's been, in various states around Australia, there's been some examples of this where, police deal with runaway kids every day, and a lot of them do come home after a few hours. But I think there's a lot to be said for parents knowing their own kids. And Bruce and Denise knew Daniel, and they knew that Daniel would not have gone off with a friend and not told them. 100% no way. And so they were told that a police car would come by later that night, and I don't believe it did. And I think they got a phone call instead, and it was late at night. And really, Bruce and Denise were frantic. They were out searching with torches. They were driving around everywhere. They were staring at the driveway for Daniel to come home. You just can't even imagine it. That they knew their own son, and to not have any clue where he was as it was getting darker. He was certainly not the kind of kid who would be out after dark. And so the next morning they were waiting at the local police station basically for the doors to open so they could go in there and say, you need to help us, he's still not home.
And once police did start to take it seriously, which it took, I think, until the next day for a real sort of missing persons case to be filed, where did they begin in terms of suspects and potential leads?
So this is something they do all the time when they believe a child has been abducted. They put together a list of known child sex offenders in the area, and they kind of go and shake them all down and say, where were you at this time? We need to know where you were. And that's what they did here. And there was quite a large number, and this is the case for everywhere, sadly, but there were quite a large number of child sex offenders known to police who were kind of in the area at the time. And so they sent out detectives to knock on all of their doors. And there were a couple of detectives who, this is 2 weeks after Daniel disappeared, were knocking on the door of Brett Peter Cowan. And they kind of recognised Brett's house as a house that they would expect belonged to a child sex offender. There were kind of little trinkets in the garden and stuff like that, little windmills. They sort of think that is a common practice for child sex offenders because those things might stand out to children. As awful as that sounds, that's something one of those police officers who knocked on the door mentioned to me. And so they knocked on Brett's door and they said, where were you at this time? And something they would learn about Brett Cowan was that he would often try and outsmart the police. He would admit to information he thought they already had and minimise everything else. And on this day, he admitted that he had driven past the bus stop where Daniel was waiting at that right time because he believed that they already had picked up his car on traffic cameras along that road. And he believed that's why they were knocking on his door, because they already knew that he'd driven past at that time. And so he said, yep, I drove along that road at that time. I was going to my boss's house to borrow a mulcher, and then I got the mulcher and I came back here and I did some gardening. Of course, those traffic cameras weren't recording. They were just sort of traffic monitoring cameras. So police hadn't known that. So he sort of stuffed up there and put himself in the exact right place at the exact right time to those detectives knocking on his door. And those detectives, given Brett's history with police, and he'd been to jail twice for abducting and abusing other children, they believed he was the guy. And in fact, they say that and they've said it in court since, that they went up the chain and they tried to alert other people that this is the guy we should be looking at.
Can you tell us a little bit about Cowan's childhood and upbringing? What kind of kid was he?
I think he is one of those cases where, I mean, it's very easy to say that child sex offenders are the way they are because they've been abused. Some evil people were just born that way. Brett came from a really good family. He had brothers who have gone along to be successful business people with their own families. He described himself as the black sheep of the family. His dad was sort of like a senior military person. Yeah, like I said, he had a good upbringing. They moved around a bit. But when he sort of spoke at the inquest years later, basically admitted that he'd been abusing children since he himself was a very young child. It's just always something that he'd done. He used to do it at the swimming pool, the local swimming pool, when he was young. Then as he got older, he was involved in petty crime, break-ins and that sort of stuff. He had issues on and off with drugs and that sort of thing. There were 2 occasions where he had done significant stints in prison for abducting and sexually abusing children. One of those cases was he was doing sort of maintenance at a childcare centre in Brisbane, and he picked up a little boy and walked with him into the toilets. He went to jail for that. The second occasion, by then he was living in a caravan park in Darwin, and that case was absolutely horrific. And years later, it would sort of be used to convince the team of detectives working on this matter that he was entirely capable of murdering a child. And this little boy he picked up from the caravan park and took him out into the bush. Not only did he sexually abuse him, he really badly injured him. And this little boy's injuries were so bad that police who investigated this matter and the Morcombe matter believed that he thought the little boy was dead when he walked away. And the little boy, in fact, walked into a petrol station and asked for help. And even then, the detectives who went to that scene at the time have told me that they sent him off in an ambulance with a police officer in the ambulance to try and talk to him because they thought he would die. It was just such a horrific case, that one. And for that, I think he was sentenced to about 7 years, and he did just over half of that in prison. So he is a bad person, obviously. He's an evil person, but he doesn't appear to be that way because anything's happened to him. He had a good upbringing in a good family.
How does that happen that he ends up spending, half his sentence in jail? Because anyone who hears that story, I mean, that seems like a short sentence anyway. And then to spend just over 3 years or whatever it was in prison, how does that happen?
Yeah, it happens more than you think. So you get a head sentence and then you get a non-parole period. And, if there's nothing dramatic that you've done while you've been in prison, you've been fairly quiet, you can apply for parole at the end of your non-parole period and then they let you out. From that one, from memory, he was initially charged with attempted murder, and then the charge was sort of negotiated down. And if you speak to the police involved in that, they're quite angry that happened. And I believe those police officers who investigated that matter believe that if he had gotten a substantial sentence, maybe he wouldn't have been driving around the Sunshine Coast that day.
Mm. Did Cowan have an alibi for the day Daniel disappeared? What did he tell police, and did he have any evidence that he'd been going, to get mulcher and therefore couldn't have come into contact with Daniel?
Yeah, so police spoke to his boss who'd lent him the mulcher, who said, yep, he was here. And then they spoke to his wife, who remembered him coming back with the mulcher and doing some gardening. But her idea of the time that he got back wasn't very solid. You know, I guess if you're going about your day and then a couple of weeks later someone says, exactly what time did that thing happen that you weren't really paying attention to because it was very mundane, you know, how can you be completely sure? She sort of based it on, I think the light was hitting the lounge room wall here or something like that. It wasn't very solid. There was a window, but it wasn't a very big window. And then the alibi became murkier some years later. I'm skipping ahead slightly here, but it came out that he'd told people that he'd actually stopped to buy some drugs from his drug dealer on the way back, which he hadn't said before. So first of all, the police were curious about that when they found out that he told someone that. And then, you know, that gave them a bit of a window that they needed to work with. So he said he stopped at his drug dealer's house and then sat down with her and had a cup of tea in the lounge room or in the kitchen, and he was there for about half an hour or so. So all of a sudden he was admitting that he was away from home for a period of time rather than just going and picking up the mulcher and coming straight back. And so then they needed to prove what he was actually doing in that window where he says he wasn't at home. So they went and spoke to that woman. They spoke to her partner. She said, I can't, because at this point, you know, this came out sometime later, she really didn't know, but she had quite a regular routine where she'd go down to the local RSL and play the pokies. And so they went to that RSL and said, you know, back in this year at this time, how did you work that? If your regulars came in here to play the pokies, did they have like, you know, membership cards or something like that? And they said, yeah, they'd have like a check-in membership card that they could log in with this machine. And so they said, well, where's the machine? And they, you know, basically went and dusted it off and pulled it out of a back room somewhere. It wasn't operational anymore. And they plugged it in to see if it would work. And sure enough, it did. And they were able to pull the records off of it and discover that that woman had actually been playing the pokies at the RSL at the time when Brett Cowan claimed he was sitting there having a cup of tea with her. So all of a sudden he's admitted to this window when he wasn't at home, and they can prove that he lied about where he was. And it wasn't a big window. It wasn't a lot of time to have abducted a child, murdered them and hidden their body. But, you know, it turns out it was enough time.
What did his ex-partners say about him? Did they think he was capable of that kind of crime and that kind of cruelty?
Yeah, so he had a lot of ex-partners. You know, obviously he was married at one point, but he left his wife and had various relationships with various other women. The woman who was living with him when he was at the caravan park in Darwin rang police not long after Daniel disappeared and said if Brett Peter Cowan was in the area at the time that that boy disappeared, he's the one who did it. I think he did like a sex offenders course when he was in prison at one point, and they told him to be open and honest with people about his background. So a lot of his girlfriends, he told them he was a pedophile. And very strangely, some of them were like, okay, thanks for being honest with me, and continued to see him. There was one woman who he never told. He became aggressive with one of her children one day, and that was it for her. You know, she just booted him immediately. And he tried to talk to her about it. And she said, there's nothing to talk about. Get out of my life, basically. And I think he sent her a present. She just threw it out or sent it back. But some of them had very unusual reactions to his background. But certainly there was at least one who came forward to police almost immediately and said it was him. And, of course, she was right.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with crime reporter and author Kate Kyriakou. In 2010, there was an inquest into Daniel Morcombe's disappearance. So we're talking, 7 years since his disappearance. What did they sort of find? How did that unfold?
So they had, by that point, a number of what they call persons of interest. I think there were about 33, and they were all, basically child sex offenders or mostly child sex offenders. And there were two in particular that I think police considered were very high-level suspects for Daniel's disappearance. And one was Brett Cowan, and the other was a man named Doug Jackway. And Jackway had a very horrific criminal history. Again, had abducted a young boy and raped him and bashed him. And in fact, was unbelievably caught in the act doing this by the boy's father and a police officer, because there was a couple of little boys going for a ride on their bikes. He'd grabbed one of them and dragged him away. And so the little boy's friends ran and got help. A local police officer and the boy's dad ended up finding him in the bush. And he still denied it. Yeah, Doug Jackway is a notorious child sex offender in Queensland. And, police thought he was capable of having abducted Daniel, and they thought the same of Brett Cowan. But with Brett Cowan and Jackway, they were both in the area. Jackway was kind of vaguely in the area. Cowan was certainly put himself right at the scene. But that doesn't mean you have enough evidence to put someone before court. So it might seem obvious that they have someone driving past with this history, but that doesn't mean they have the evidence. So it was a very hard road for police, and it was a huge investigation where they, certainly rattled a lot of cages and put a huge amount of effort into it. And so by the inquest, they were basically reviewing some of the evidence that they had on various people, and certainly Brett Cowan. So there were some detectives who did a review on all the evidence they had on Brett Cowan in the lead up to the inquest. And it was at that point that they did that work to break his alibi. And so when Brett appeared at the inquest, I personally I was not working in Queensland as a journalist when the inquest happened, so I didn't sit in that particular series of hearings, which went late 2010 to early 2011. But I have spoken to the journalists who did, and they said to me when Jackway walked into court, they were all convinced he was the guy. And then a day or two later, Brett Cowan walks into court and takes a stand, and then they're like, no, wait, this is the guy. So even the journalists sitting in there were quite convinced they were both very capable of it. But then when Brett Cowan came in, they were like, this has got to be the guy. So it's at this point that police start a really big push to see if they can get more evidence on Brett Cowan. At this point, he's living in Perth. They have to fly him to Brisbane. He really didn't want to come to Brisbane. He tried to get out of it. They flew into Brisbane to give evidence at the inquest. And then when he flew back on the plane to Perth, they had a covert police officer sitting next to him.
They had done sort of comprehensive psychological profiling on Brett Cowan to work out who he was and what he was interested in and what maybe some of his weaknesses were. What sort of things had they determined about him, and how do you go about creating a psychological profile of someone in the first place?
So they had to do this to see if he would be a good candidate for the covert operation that they ended up using on him. So the Mr. Big sting or covert scenario, which, we can explain a bit in a minute, only really works on certain personality types. So they had to try and work out, obviously without sitting him down in front of a psychologist or psychiatrist, what kind of person he was, just to see if he would be susceptible to falling for this covert scenario, I guess, to see if he'd sort of be gullible for it. So they spoke to a lot of people in his life, and I imagine they kind of did that, without letting on the reason for it. And they sort of determined that he was a guy who liked to big note himself. He would make up sort of outlandish stories about himself or exaggerate. He kind of moved between lots of different little jobs. He couldn't really keep a stable job. He had all sorts of really unusual sexual fetishes. He was kind of like a bit of a pathetic sort of figure where he didn't have a lot of close friends. He was ostracised from his family, even though his parents continued to help him for years and years because they wanted him to stop offending. They wanted him to stop hurting people. So they thought if he had their support and they did all these things for him, then maybe he would come good, which of course he never did. He was also living in a situation where he didn't have steady work. He was a drug user. He had very little money. You know, he didn't even have money to top up the phone card on his mobile phone. All of those sorts of things put him in a very good position to be a target of this particular covert operation.
So what was the plan? What did they want to do in order to get this man, who at this point they had no existing sort of relationship with, to confess?
Yeah, so initially they put a covert operative on the plane next to him to befriend him. They knew that he had an interest in sort of tinkering with cars. So this particular covert officer, whose covert name is Joe, he sat next to him on the plane and he had a story where he was moving to Perth, needed to sort of get himself set up, find somewhere to live and get, a cheap secondhand car. And so we had, 5 hours or so on the flight between Brisbane and Perth to sort of befriend Brett. And hopefully the plan was that they could get Brett to offer to help him look for a secondhand car and sort of, because Brett was obviously very mechanically minded. That was their plan initially, and then it sort of very quickly morphed into this Mr. Big Sting, which became something much more elaborate and would go on for, a few months.
So talk us through what that entailed, the Mr. Big Sting.
Yeah, so the Mr. Big Sting has, been done in quite a few different states in Australia. The Victorians have used it a lot. Perth had just done one, and I think that's where they come up with the idea. The detectives in Perth sort of mentioned that they'd just done it successfully on a case there. And so the Mr. Big Sting is where a large number of covert officers pose as an organised crime gang, and they very gently and slowly lure this person, the target, into their organised crime gang. Have them working on all sorts of organised crime type jobs. In this case, everything from buying crayfish off the, back of a truck to sell to restaurants, to smuggling diamonds and bringing in a big shipment of drugs, moving guns through bikies, all that sort of stuff. But they really put themselves as a professional organisation that doesn't really believe in violence. And they're a business, they're a professional outfit. They're not like the bikies who get themselves into trouble and end up in the media and end up with all this police attention because maybe they're bashing people or, shooting each other in the street. They're not like that. They're professional. They stay well under the radar of the police. In fact, they have some, dirty police on their books who give them information. And so with Brett, Joe, the covert operative, introduced him to some guys that he works with and said, hey, they're always looking for some people to do a bit of work for them, just a bit of cash. And the first job that they got him to do, from memory, the first decent job was they sent him to the airport and they said, we're just waiting for this guy to get off a plane. And they gave him a photo of a guy and they said, can you just ring us when you see him get off the plane? So they had him sitting at the airport waiting for this guy. And then they rang him and said, don't worry, we've just spotted him, all good. Here's $100 or so for your time. And so Brett thought, well, this is really easy money for a guy basically living in a caravan park who couldn't afford to put credit on his phone. And then it moved from there and they got him involved in more and more stuff. And as time went by, these guys involved in this group that Joe introduced him to became friends of his, and he felt like he fit in and that he belonged. And every day these guys would make sure they would kind of bring up the words, loyalty, trust, all that sort of stuff. They'd say those words over and over, kind of like a subliminal thing, so that he knew he was with this group of guys who had each other's backs. They looked out for each other. They respected each other. There was a very firm hierarchy. They sort of emphasised that all the time as well. There was sort of, the on-the-ground workers, and then above them were kind of like the state operators, and then above them there was the big, big boss a guy called Arnold. And when they spoke about Arnold, they spoke about him with, great respect. He was their boss. He was the reason they were all there, earning all this great money, doing all these cool things. And, they go out to restaurants and eat really fancy lunches and stuff like that and shout Brett. And he became so entrenched in this world that he at one point said to one of the guys, this is the stuff dreams are made of.
Do we have any sense of how much all of this cost? Because reading your account in the book of the taking Brett out and obviously paying him for particular services, that would have been an enormously costly operation, I'd imagine.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm not sure how much it would have cost, but if you include all of the man hours and stuff like that, yeah, definitely it's a costly exercise. The entire investigation was a costly exercise, but it was an important one. And the commissioner at the time, Bob Atkinson, I have no doubt he would have signed off on anything to find answers for the Morcombes.
And how about that day when Brett has been spending a lot of time with these people who have talked about loyalty and trust, and they sort of said to him, we need to know anything that you've done so that we can cover for you, so that we can ensure that no one can ever, find out that you're responsible. What happened that day and how did Brett actually confess to what he'd done to Daniel?
Yeah, so the whole point of the Mr. Big sting, and by the way, I should add that this whole operation was developed in Canada and the Canadians have been doing it for years and years. So how it works is, you get him really involved in the group, and then along the way you make it clear that, they've got police who they pay for information to keep them safe, and under the radar. And they do various things throughout the operation to show that that's the case. They end up sending Joe off to London. And if this was a visual thing, I'd be putting that in air quotes because, of course, they didn't. But they basically said the cops had warned them that Joe had, was on the radar. So they had to go hide him away overseas and give him a new life. So they'd made that very clear to Brett that they could do that. And then it gets to the point basically where they have this big job coming up, moving drugs in via a small plane. And they had Brett watching like a small airport for them, which he really seemed to love. They basically said, we want to bring you in on this job. Everyone involved in this job is going to earn $100,000, which is obviously more money than Brett's ever had at one time, certainly. They said, we need to make sure that you're clean. We've all got backgrounds. We're not worried about anything you might have done. We're not here to judge you. We've all been in trouble with the police, but we just need to make sure that there's no reason that the cops might be looking at you now. So they run a, fake background check on Brett, and he gets called in to speak to, Mr. Big, Arnold. And they basically tell him that they're going to resume the inquest over in Queensland. He's going to be recalled. We've found this out through running a background check on you through our police that we have in our pocket. They're going to try and pin the abduction and murder of a 13-year-old boy in Queensland on you. And so they call him into this meeting in a fancy hotel room with Mr. Big, with Arnold, and they sit him down and they say to him, Arnold says to him, I need to know what you've done. Do we need to buy you an alibi? Do we need to get rid of any evidence? What have you done? And he says, I didn't do anything. I was just in the area at the time, and because of my background, they've tried to pin it on me, but I wasn't there. I didn't do it. And he basically said, that's not good enough. The police, they've told me that it was you who did it. And that's going to draw some heat. If we're going to be moving a big drug shipment and one of the people on our team is about to be arrested for murder, we can't have you working with us. So either you tell us what we need to know, tell us what you've done, so we can make sure there's nothing that's going to come back on you and therefore on us, or you're out. So they sort of put this ultimatum on him where he was so obsessed with this new life. He was making good money. He had friends. He felt like he belonged for the first time in his life because, he would tell everyone he was a pedophile. His family knew he was a pedophile, so he'd always been an outcast. And all of a sudden he belonged, and they were about to take that away from him unless he confessed. And so he did.
What did he say had happened to Daniel that day?
So, I mean, this was such a huge moment for police when he finally said, yeah, okay, I did it. And then he took them through everything that he'd done. And I think most people are of the belief here, particularly Bruce and Denise Morcombe, and I certainly won't disagree with their views here. I believe, and everyone believes, that Brett, again, has minimised what he's done here. So he said that he convinced Daniel to get into his car when that bus went past. And he said to him, are you headed to the plaza? I was supposed to pick someone up who was on that bus. So now I'm going to have to drive to the plaza to get them. Just jump in and you can come with me. Daniel was a good kid who knew about stranger danger and all of that sort of stuff. And he was also running super late. No one can ever know why he got into Cowan's car. It's incredibly tragic that he did. Also he was a good kid, right? So when an adult's telling you to do something, it's very hard to say no if you're a good kid. And so he got into the car, and of course, Brett didn't drive him to the plaza. In fact, he drove him the opposite direction. He drove him to a macadamia farm with like a kind of abandoned, demountable building there. Brett knew about it because he used to go to that demountable and have sex with people there. And that's where he took Daniel. He says that he didn't even get to molest him because Daniel tried to run away and he grabbed around the neck and accidentally killed him. Nobody really believes that that's how it happened. Bruce Morcombe, in his victim impact statement in court, actually asked, if that was the case, why did you take my son's clothes off? Why was his belt not through the loops of his shorts? And so, yeah, again, I think Brett has admitted to what he thinks he has to admit to and nothing more. So then they got him to draw a map of where he left Daniel's body, and then they flew him, still posing as this group, they flew him back to the Sunshine Coast to go to that scene to see if they could find any evidence that might impact on their big drug move that they were doing. So he flew in there with these covert officers. He took them and said, this is where I left Daniel. I threw his clothes in this creek here. And then, they came back again the next day. And when they came back, there were a whole bunch of police basically hiding behind trees and in the bush who came out and arrested him there at the scene.
Did his confession lead to the discovery of Daniel's remains?
Yes, it absolutely did. In fact, there's a lot of similarities, I think, between that search and the one that they've been doing for William Tyrrell at the moment. So because 7 or 8 years had passed by this time, they had to go and consult with a large number of experts about how far would they need to dig. Would the floods of 2011 have moved any evidence, or would the water have risen and then receded again? What would have happened with, even really awful things like animal activity? They had to consult with so many different people. And so they were given information that, if you dig a certain amount, you should get down to the soil level as it would have been in 2003. And so they got in excavators, they got in a huge number of SES volunteers, police, and they sifted through the dirt there. And it was really difficult country too, it was really thick Queensland bush. And they went through every square centimetre of dirt, a decent area there. And by this point, Brett had been arrested, and police had done that knowing that maybe they'd never find any evidence that Daniel was left. Maybe they'd never find his remains. Maybe they'd never find anything. But they had to do that with the confidence that they could get a conviction regardless. So it took them 4 or 5 days before they found the first piece of evidence, and that was one of Daniel's shoes. And then they found quite a few bone fragments in the days after that. And then they found, I guess, what was left of his clothing in the creek. They had divers in there looking, and they found his, shorts and I think the waistband of his underwear, all of these things which made it very, very clear that Brett did, in fact, leave Daniel's body there. And I only recently spoke to, former Police Commissioner Bob Atkinson about this search. And he said to me, I said to him, did you get information from all the experts that you consulted that it was still possible to find something after this time? And he said, well, the chance was small, but we did. But regardless, we were going to do that level of search anyway. It didn't really matter. If they'd said to us, it's not really possible to find anything now, he said, it didn't matter. We had to do our sort of due diligence. He told us that's where he left Daniel, so we had to try no matter, what the odds were. But the most important thing about all of that was that Bruce and Denise were able to have a funeral for their son, and they had some answers about what happened to their son.
What was Cowan ultimately sentenced to?
Life in jail with a non-parole period of 20 years. Queensland has only just recently passed laws that make it a bit easier to... what happens here is you serve your 20 years and then you apply for parole, and if you get knocked back, you can apply a year later. And, it's not that far away that Bruce and Denise are going to have Brett applying for parole, and they know that. And it's going to be a horrific process for them waiting to see if he gets out. And so they recently brought in laws that mean the head of the Parole Board Queensland can make a declaration against somebody who has either murdered a child or murdered multiple people. And that declaration means that they are prevented from applying for parole if they get knocked back for, up to 10 years. And there can be multiple declarations made against the same person. And they're sort of trying to, for these people who are just really, really, really evil people, to stop the families from going through that horror every 12 months. Are they going to get out? Are they going to get out? Are they going to hurt somebody else? So
I can't imagine what that would do to you emotionally and the work that would be involved in ensuring they don't. I wanted to end on Daniel himself. What do you think his legacy is? What have his parents worked so hard to ensure that little boy's legacy is?
Oh, and particularly here in Queensland, you can see his legacy because every single kid in Queensland and, most parts of Australia too, know Daniel's story. So what Bruce and Denise have done is they've set up the foundation that they run, the Daniel Morcombe Foundation, and they go to schools and they talk to children about what happened to them and their son's story, what happened to Daniel, and they basically teach about stranger danger, but in a very, very effective way. And they also talk to children about if there's someone in their life, because I think most people are aware that most offending against children occurs within the home or from people who who are in your life. The whole stranger abduction, stranger sexual assault thing is very rare. It's mostly someone someone in your life. So they give children the tools to understand what behaviour is wrong, because often children are groomed, so who they can speak to, who they can ask for help. And that sort of message, just about every child in Australia is taught that through Bruce and Denise. And certainly in Queensland, when you talk to children in Queensland, they all know who Daniel Morcombe is. Most of them have met Bruce and Denise, and they all know what's out there help-wise if someone makes them feel uncomfortable. And imagine how many children they've helped. And I know from speaking to Bruce and Denise that kids have come up to them, after their sessions at schools and directly said, this is happening to me, what do I do? So, incredible legacy.
What they do and their work has changed a lot of lives across the country, and it's incredible, incredible work. And I think you're right that there wouldn't be many Australians who don't recognise the face of Daniel Morcombe. And if that's, one thing that can come out of it, that kids know what to look out for, then, that's a tiny little good thing out of what is otherwise an unimaginable tragedy. Kate Kyriakou is the Brisbane Courier Mail's chief crime reporter. She's won awards both at a state and national level for her work as a crime writer, and she's written a book about the undercover operation that caught Daniel Morcombe's killer. It's called The Sting, and you can find it at any good bookstore or online through the link in our episode description. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and my executive producer is Gia Moylan. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.